All right, everyone, welcome back to English 211. Today we're going to wrap up Silent Spring. We had several days worth of readings on this, including Silent Spring, or at least the first two chapters, two very famous chapters of an entire book of nonfiction. The book that started the environmental movement in America, most would say. So maybe what we can do is just say two general things about this first. Right here with A and B. The things that I think of, and we'll be looking at this, of course, through our idea of the public sphere, public communication, discourse communities, as well as just looking at the book as sort of an environmental book and looking at it historically as well. But the two things we could say right off, there is in some ways a lack of scientific discourse. It doesn't sound like science, even though clearly it involves science and ecological thinking. This is most prominent in the opening. I'm sure you all noticed it, of course. The opening is literary. It feels like a novel, not a public message, not a risk communication, trying to get the public to act and feel threatened in the way that we would expect from, say, a government release, right? It doesn't feel like a scientific warning. Rather, if we just take a quick peek at it here, we can go to the beginning here, and it even opens up with a fable, right? A fable for tomorrow. And you might recall that there's all this beautiful language and style, and it continues throughout the piece, right? And so it does become a fable. We've learned that the town does not actually exist, but it could, and it may in the future, right? So it's a moral tale of where we are in the present and where we might be in the future, okay? And so that's an easy way to think about this, and it doesn't sound like science clearly for that reason. The other thing that we know all these things now. This is B. We know all of these things now. Seems old hat, right? But no one really was thinking about this when Carson wrote this. She was writing this in the late 50s, or at least in the early 60s. And as you know from the introduction, which you read on day 2 for the readings, this was really a big deal when it came out. It changed the way Americans thought about what was happening in agriculture and with all those chemicals that they were using to control the world and modify the world in some way. For the first time, people started asking questions, and it was, assumed that they might be bad for us rather than there was a neutral or maybe even a positive effect. Who knows? So let's just take a look at the language here. Let's do a little bit of a rhetorical analysis. In fact, what we should do first, actually, is we should tie this back into some goals for a course, right? Because we can look at this many ways, and depending what course you read this in, you could do different things with it. What I might just say quickly, let's revisit our notes on discourse communities. You might notice here that this is the beginning of creating a public, or the beginning of creating a discourse community. There was essentially no environmental movement. There was no fear of the toxins and the chemicals that were used for agricultural purposes. And so here we might say that she's starting a discourse community, starting a public. And we can just see that if we look at these 6 things and say, well, does she have these things going on? Has a broadly agreed set of common public goals? Well, she does, it would appear, but there's no public to go along with her, right? There's no one that agrees with her necessarily. She does cite some research at various points in the book, but she doesn't have an audience. She is engaging an audience on the issue, has mechanisms of intercommunication among members. Well, there's no members, right? So the way that this is written probably has to be a fable, has to be a moral tale in some way. It's hard to be logical and convince people through logic when you don't have a network behind you supporting that logic. If the logic was there, it was in the scientific community, and she was delivering it in a way to the public that they would find acceptable. Here, what's interesting is we think of genres and we think of specific lexis. She's starting to build that, right? We might actually look down at publics and take this a step further. Clearly, she's not focusing on identity, but probably focused on the issue, environmentalism, if we want to be simple about it. So this is an issue-based public. Does she want to change the laws and customs and regulations of the world? Certainly so, right? May argue through traditional means. There is some logical argument in there, and we'll certainly take a quick look at it, but can be subversive. As you know, she was attacked for being too subversive. She wasn't scientific enough, whether it's in her writing style or sadly because she was a woman. But certainly we could say that Silent Spring is subversive just in its literariness, and that it adopts a fable to tell a scientific story. even though it's not really a scientific story. It's an ethical and moral story. It's a human health story, and therefore it's just a human story, right? But we can see that this does start to meet the interesting part of public communication, and that it is subversive and will use, if we look to E here, whatever it needs to communicate its message, right? And so this is all interesting stuff, and we can see how this is starting to build a public, starting to build a community. It doesn't have one yet, but it already has the interesting forms, the non-logical forms, oftentimes, that we see. All right, so that connects us back to some of our previous points in the course. If we want to just do a quick rhetorical analysis here, here are some things that you probably saw that are worth mentioning and modeling. All right, if we just want to take a look at this quick, we can look at the opening lines and say a few interesting things here. Many ways to analyze this, but if we just look at paragraph 1, page 1 kind of sets the scene. We can see something here. It kind of sounds almost like a novel, right? There was once a town. Sounds like it could be a Mark Twain novel or a modern novel of, springtime in New England or something like this. All the nice language here describing the town, the clouds of bloom, right? The foxes barking and the deer and all this type of stuff. So we're really not prepared for the scientific element of this quite yet. Page 2, however, it seems to start to use rhetoric to influence us. What we get in the beginning is a first line that takes us into the past, some sort of like golden age past here. These qualities where things are numerous and abundant. We can see that here. Countless birds came to feed, right? Others came to fish in streams, great distances to observe them, right? So this is some natural wonder that's happening here, of course. But then, after this paragraph of abundance, the way things used to be, the golden age paragraph, right? Suddenly a strange blight creeps in, and look at what the animals are dying. It's a spell, right? It seems almost magical. I want to talk about a fable. Here's the language of the fable, borrowing from all things mystical and religious and all of this type of stuff. Almost supernatural rather than natural, right? So we get a mix of these types of storytellings, even though this is scientific, right? In the end. This idea of settling upon the community. Notice the community is defined. She says community, but she doesn't talk about people. The first thing she talks about is chickens and cattle, right? And sheep and the animals dying. They're part of the community too, right? So she's talking about the food chain, right? The things that keep us alive. And so she's doing this very deliberately in order to sell her point and give us an ecological viewpoint. So we do see the science inside of this fable. Then suddenly the farmers, who are the local experts on livestock in particular, and we hear from the doctors, who are the experts in people. So you could say she's using apocalyptic rhetoric to frighten us, but she's also giving us the environmental viewpoint, the human viewpoint, and the community viewpoint all at the same time. If we want to move on a little bit farther past sort of this supernaturalism, this mystery, the unexplained deaths and the people who are puzzled, right? All this mystery, all this uncertainty. And science is supposed to bring us certainty, and the narrative of people controlling nature is we're certain we're controlling nature and we can predict what's going to happen, but she's giving us all this uncertainty, right, inside of this fable. So she's questioning science, right? Science can produce as much uncertainty as certainty. And so underneath, inside of this fable, we see a questioning of science beginning, at least if we know where the book is going eventually. One thing that's interesting is that there's, if we move on a bit, images of rot and decay and death. And for the reader, there's a tie to human reproduction. Remember, arguing for the environment itself may not change people's minds. You've got to bring it down to human scale. And we start to see that here. On the farms, the hens brooded, no chicks hatched. The farmers complained they were unable to raise pigs. The litters were small, survived only a few days. If you're a person, you're reading this and thinking, well, does that mean I also cannot have children, right? So this isn't just an attack on animals of the food chain. This is pointing out that maybe people will have problems reproducing, and so we're bringing it into the family and human values, of course, right? So there's a lot going on inside of here. Really, really excellent writing, a lot of rhetorical layers, a lot of things that we could analyze deeply, all this mixed inside of just the larger genre of the fable. Of course, one of the most surprising moments, I think, for me is when she finally says, the first time I was reading this especially, I was surprised. This town does not actually exist, but it might easily do so. And so she is uncovering her rhetoric now. She's saying, okay, listen, I've been giving you a fable. This is not science. but you should be worried nonetheless. So an interesting way of presenting an argument. The last thing we might say of the end of the closing is that it is it's the transfer of the present to the future, right? So these things are happening a little bit. These types of things have been recorded. If you put them all together and add them all up, this is what our future could look like. And that's where she closes her introduction and her argument. And what I find fascinating about this is that chapter 2, the other chapter you had, she opens up in a very argumentative format, the obligation to endure. She doesn't keep telling us about all these bad things that are going to happen. Rather, she needs to prove that it's worth humans' while to stick around. So who's going to endure? Well, humans should, and we have an obligation to, right? So if we think of Silent Spring as an entire book, even though we didn't read the whole thing, this chapter 2, obligation to endure, is the ethical background, the warrant, if we want to think of it that way. Humans must survive. Now, naturally, other communities may disagree with this. Human existence, especially in the future, may mean little to some communities. We could say some religious communities, even though there's plenty of religious communities that think we're the Earth's stewards and we should take care of the Earth. But to some, it may not matter. And it might not be religious groups. It could be, existential groups, nihilists, who knows. But Carson is making an argument for an entire chapter that we must endure, and she's explaining why that is. So she opens up with this chapter 2, to settle and persuade the importance of humanity in our future. Right. After all, here's one thing we can say. This chapter proves she is a social ecologist. Not that she thinks that people and nature are on the same level in importance, but rather people are more important. And she wants that balance, ecologically speaking, but to help humans survive. She doesn't want us to go extinct. And that makes her a particular brand of environmentalist. I won't go through the whole chapter, but I will just point out a few other things that are going on that are important to note. These are things that will, again, help you with future rhetorical analyses, help you understand publics, help you understand rhetorical frameworks. They might even pay off for your first paper as well in this course. So the chapter, we see the difference between environmental writing and scientific writing here. You would never say the following in scientific writing. The most alarming of all man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers, and sea. Words like alarming and assault, they're metaphors, right? And so again, we're lost in literary language, and beautiful literary language at that. But you would never say anything like that in a scientific paper, no matter how high level the concern, right? She covers massive territory very quickly. We see that she covers the air, the earth, the rivers, the sea, all of this. If this were a scientific paper, you're going to focus on one and you're going to stay there. But she does not do that. We do see an interesting mix here of, a chain of evil, which is, again, religious terminology in some way, or moral terminology. And right after that, we learn of strontium-90, released through nuclear explosions into the air. Right. And so we've got this weird mix of the religious or the mystical and the scientific right there next to each other. This is one of the first books to really do that. I think we take that for granted now, 50 years later, or more than 50 years later. This was all very, very new at the time that it was written. And she's building a public, and she's building a style to suit that public. And she's using a religious or mystical framework to make a scientific argument in many ways. So interesting stuff. All right. If we want to move on just a little bit more, on page 6, the end of the first paragraph, there's this rhetoric of mystery again appearing down here. Pause and take a read through, and you will see it. So she's returning this idea of mystery, uncertainty, rather than certainty, the certainty we're supposed to have in this modern age where science and humankind and our brilliance can control everything. The interesting thing, though, is she does ping-pong back and forth. If we take a look at this paragraph here, she's explaining evolution to us. So again, if you want to reread this paragraph quickly, pause the video. And so we can see her back in the scientific, but again, making an argument through evolution, because we find out soon after that things are out of control. Right. One of my favorite passages where we see a new rhetorical framework. We see sort of this Cold War rhetoric. We're afraid of science. Science might be a little out of control. And that's what people were thinking about in the 50s and 60s after the end of World War II and the first nuclear explosions, right? But we see that here too, the rapidity of change and speed. right? The heedless pace, our impetuousness, new situations. All of these things are a framework of speed and that we're out of control. We can't contain these things that we've made. So that is a very, very deliberate rhetorical strategy as well that she uses to show that the science isn't quite as controlled. It may not be as good for us as we think it is. Of course, it's tied into Cold War rhetoric, and we see that transferred to environmental rhetoric here. We're about out of time. We'll pick it up in the next video, and we'll talk about the other readings.